It's July 1984, and a mad gunman has been in the McDonald's in San Isidro for more than 30 minutes, shooting everyone in sight. He'd revisit his victims to make sure they were dead and shoot them again if they were not, or even if they were. By this point, nearly everyone who was in the restaurant has been killed. But there's a small group of employees crouched between two of the aisles. They managed to stay quiet to avoid detection for over half an hour. But the man on a rampage finally discovered them. He comes over, and like he'd done for everyone else he encountered, he immediately began shooting them. As he's shooting at the final person, he runs out of ammunition and goes back to the front of the restaurant to reload so he can return and finish the job. The 17-year-old young man has been shot 5 times, but is still alive. And despite being shot in the leg and unable to walk, he crawls and drags himself down a flight of 25 stairs and hides in a basement closet, joining one of the few groups of survivors of the deadliest mass shooting, up until that point. Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning until well after other reporting ends. For today's case, we're not gonna sugarcoat it. It's a real gut puncher. If incredibly sad and senseless cases are tough for you, we definitely recommend you skip this one. Thank you to BB for recommending this case in the comments. We weren't sure we could get through it, but we've taken it in chunks, and here it is. If you find it too much for you, we absolutely understand, and we'll see you on the next one. For those of you staying, grab your tissues as we cover this brutal case of evil, sadness, and some of the bravest souls to have ever walked this planet. San Isidro is a community within the city of San Diego, California, bordering Tijuana, Mexico. It is the most southern community in California, sitting just north of the border between the United States and Mexico. Being the busiest international border crossing in the entire world, San Isidro is known as the gateway to the Americas, supporting tourists from many countries. In 1984, San Isidro had a population of about 25,000, 93% of whom were Hispanic, and approximately 3% of whom were white. That was the year that James Huberty and his wife Etna moved to the community. James Oliver Huberty was born in Canton, Ohio on October 1st, 1942. In the early 1950s, Huberty's father purchased a farm in the Pennsylvania Amish country. But Huberty's mother refused to live in the Amish country and left the family to become a religious missionary. From then on, Huberty became a loner with an explosive personality. After Huberty's parents split, his father remarried a young schoolteacher, but they didn't get along. When Huberty's father, who was explosive himself, would arrive home each day, he'd fire off 10 to 12 shots to warn the family that he was almost home. In 1962, Huberty enrolled at a community college, earning a degree in sociology. He later attended the Pittsburgh Institute of Mortuary Science, where he received a license in embalming. It was there that he met Etna Markland. The two married in 1965 and had 2 daughters. The family of 4 would soon move from Canton to Massacre, Ohio, where Huberty found work as a welder. There, the couple would establish their reputation for violent behavior, with James Huberty once shooting his German Shepherd in the head when a neighbor complained about it damaging his car. And another neighbor noted how he'd noticed Huberty's front door ajar, with Huberty sitting just inside it, holding a shotgun. Threats and altercations toward neighbors were frequent, and Etna was volatile as well, once threatening another mom with a 9mm handgun after an altercation which Etna herself aggressively initiated. Domestic violence was also a regular occurrence in the household, as were complaints from neighbors about the Hubertys, and from the Hubertys about neighbors. When calls would come into the local police station about minor incidents, officers would joke that it was the Hubertys again. Then, in 1982, after 10 years of working as a welder in Massacre, Huberty was laid off. As a result, he became concerned about making his house payments. He worried constantly, and he blamed the country, the government, and Ronald Reagan for his misfortune. He was so disenchanted with his country that he applied for residency in Mexico, an odd fact since he was known to harbor extreme hatred toward immigrants, especially Mexican immigrants. He also stockpiled food and weapons, a lot of them, including an Israeli-made, military-style Uzi machine gun. The following year, 1983, the family moved briefly to Tijuana, Mexico. Then finally to San Isidro in January of 1984. There, Huberty landed a job as a security guard, but he was fired on July 10th, 8 days before the shooting, due to poor work performance and general physical instability. On the day before the shooting, 41-year-old James Huberty called the San Diego Mental Health Clinic requesting an appointment. He had shared with Edna a couple days prior to that he felt like he was having a mental health problem. The clinic receptionist told Huberty that someone would call him back within hours. According to Edna, Huberty sat quietly by the phone waiting for the return call for several hours. At the clinic, since Huberty's polite demeanor didn't convey any urgency, and since he'd never been hospitalized for any mental health issues in the past, she logged the call as non-crisis, which slated it to be handled within 48 hours. After waiting, Huberty left for a while, returned, had dinner with his family, and appeared normal. The next morning, Huberty attended a minor traffic court hearing, then took his family to lunch at a nearby McDonald's, different from the one of the incident, and then to visit the San Diego Zoo. While strolling the zoo, he told Edna that his life is effectively over and that society had their chance, referring to the clinic's failure to return his call the previous day. The family returned home after the zoo. It was right after that, at around 3:45 p.m., that Huberty walked into their bedroom where Edna was relaxing and kissed her goodbye, something he'd normally not do. She asked him where he was going, and he calmly replied that he was going hunting for humans. Edna would later state that she didn't take him seriously, as he made similarly bizarre statements throughout their marriage. The couple's 12-year-old daughter, Zelia, who noticed that her father was strapped with all of his weaponry as he was leaving, assumed he was going out to target practice at a rural location, like he often did to alleviate anger. But he was not. James Huberty got into his black Mercury Marquis and drove. He first drove toward a Big Bear supermarket, then toward a U.S. post office, before finally entering the parking lot of the McDonald's at approximately 3:56 p.m., just a short block from his Averill Road apartment. He was carrying a Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol, modified to make it automatic, a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, and a 9mm Uzi semi-automatic rifle, the weapon he would primarily use during the massacre. He also had a box and a cloth bag filled with hundreds of rounds of ammunition for each weapon. 45 customers were inside the restaurant. Sadly, mass shootings in the US are all too commonplace today. But in 1984, they were an almost non-existent occurrence. So as the massacre began to unfold, the understandably unassuming victims in the restaurant thought the whole thing was a joke. And they, along with law enforcement, were placed in unfamiliar territory, without effective strategies for survival or for stopping the massacre. Huberty entered the restaurant and, armed with the Uzi, he first aimed it at 16-year-old employee John Arnold. Huberty pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. As he checked to see what was wrong with his gun, 22-year-old Neva Kane, the restaurant's manager who had just returned from her honeymoon, began walking toward John, who was already walking away, figuring the whole thing was a distasteful joke. By then, Huberty had corrected the problem with his gun, fired a test shot into the ceiling, then aimed the weapon at Neva, shooting her in the head. She would die minutes later. He then immediately shot Arnold, wounding him in the chest and arm, just before shouting, "Everybody on the ground." Then he called everyone in the primarily Latino-populated restaurant dirty swine and Vietnam assholes, before stating that he had killed thousands in Vietnam and that he intended to kill 1,000 more, even though he had never served in the military nor killed anyone. Hearing Huberty's ranting and seeing the two people shot, 25-year-old customer Victor Rivera tried to persuade Huberty to not shoot anyone else. Huberty responded by shooting Victor 14 times, shouting at him to shut up the entire time. Customers and employees scrambled to hide behind booths, tables, and counters. Next, he shot 11-year-old Aurora Pina, wounding her in the leg. She was being shielded by her incredibly brave 18-year-old pregnant aunt, Jackie Reyes, whom Huberty shot with his Uzi 48 times, sadly rendering her poor body in a condition that would later prevent her family from laying her to rest in the lovely pink dress they got for her, because there wasn't enough of her intact. Jackie's 8-month-old baby, Carlos Reyes, who had just been baptized 1 month prior to that, sat up and began crying. Huberty shouted at the baby, then shot him in the back, killing him. Then Huberty shot and killed 62-year-old Lawrence Louise, a truck driver who was retiring that day after 40 years of driving. His family panicked when they saw his truck in the parking lot on television. They learned of his death hours later. Huberty then proceeded to a family crouched near the play area of the restaurant where a couple was shielding their son and his friend underneath the tables with their bodies. The mother, Blythe Reagan Herrera, had barricaded her son, Mateo, under one booth, while her husband, Ronald Herrera, guarded his son's friend, Keith Thomas, under another. Ronald instructed Keith not to move, and when Huberty approached them, he shot Ronald 6 times in the stomach, chest, arm, hip, shoulder, and head. Ronald miraculously survived. Keith was also shot in the arm, wrist, and left elbow, but he was blocked from most of the bullets by Ronald. Keith also survived and would later recall how Ronald saved his life and how he couldn't feel any pain from the bullets. Ronald's caring and loving wife, Blythe, and his artistic, musical son, Mateo, were both killed, having been shot numerous times in the head. Near the Herreras, 3 women were also hiding beneath a booth. 24-year-old Guadalupe Del Rio was wedged against a wall, shielded by her friends, 25-year-old Gloria Ramirez, and 31-year-old Araceli Vilves Vargas. Guadalupe was shot several times, but not seriously wounded. Gloria, miraculously, was not hit, and Araceli, tragically, received a single shot to the back of her head. She died the next day. She would be the only person fatally wounded who lived long enough to reach a hospital. Huberty next killed 45-year-old banker Hugo Velasquez Vasquez, shooting him once in the chest, killing him. The first call to police to report the shooting was made at 4 p.m. The call notified police that a child had been shot and taken to the U.S. Post Office on San Isidro Boulevard. The dispatcher mistakenly sent responding officers to the wrong McDonald's 2 miles or 3 kilometers from the San Isidro location, costing several precious minutes of the area not being locked down, during which time several other victims, unaware of what was happening inside, approached the restaurant. Starting with Lydia Flores. At just after 4 p.m., Lydia drove into the parking lot and headed to the drive-thru window. She noticed shattered glass and heard gunshots. She immediately looked up and saw Huberty through the window, shooting. She reversed her car and crashed into a fence. She then hid in bushes with her 2-year-old daughter until the shooting ended. Then, at approximately 4:05 p.m., married couple Astolfo and Maricela Felix drove into the parking lot and immediately noticed the shattered glass. Astolfo assumed that the restaurant was being renovated or repaired, and that Huberty, who was making his way toward their car, was one of the construction crew. Huberty fired both his shotgun and his Uzi. The couple and their 4-month-old baby, Carla, called Carlita. He shot Maricela in the face, arms, and chest, blinding her in one eye and rendering one of her hands permanently unusable. Baby Carlita was wounded in the chest, abdomen, and neck. Astolfo was wounded in the chest and head. The couple managed to stagger away from Huberty's line of fire, and Maricela handed her crying baby to her husband, who in turn handed her to a stranger named Lucia Velasco just as Maricela collapsed. Lucia handed the baby to a police officer, and the two rushed the baby to the hospital, Lucia holding her hand over one of the baby's wounds to try to contain the bleeding, and the officer using the hand he wasn't driving with to contain another wound. Maricela, Astolfo, and baby Carlita all survived. Then there were 3 11-year-old boys. They'd just gone to get donuts. One of the friends wanted ice cream as well, so they rode their BMX bikes to the McDonald's. As they pedaled into the parking lot, they heard someone from across the street yelling at them, but they couldn't make out what they were saying. So they hesitated. It was right then that Huberty shot all three boys. David Flores Delgado received several gunshot wounds to his head and died instantly. Omar Alonso Hernandez received several gunshots to his back and died a few minutes later. And Joshua Coleman, critically wounded in the back, arm, and leg, collapsed, but was still alive. He just watched his friend David get killed. And then he watched Omar, his happy, humble best friend, with whom he conversed back and forth over their backyard fences as they helped each other learn the other's native language, struggle until he too died. So Joshua, having previously pondered what he might do were he in a similarly dire situation, laid still, playing dead, until the SWAT team would later come to rescue him, over an hour later. Next, Huberty targeted an elderly couple that was walking toward the entrance. 74-year-old Miguel Victoria Ulloa and 69-year-old Ada Velasquez Victoria. Huberty shot Ada in the face, which also wounded Miguel. Miguel instinctively began cradling his wife and wiping blood from her face while cursing at Huberty. Huberty swore back at Miguel, then shot him in the head, killing him. About 10 minutes after the first call to police had been placed, police arrived at the correct McDonald's. As soon as the first patrol car arrived, Huberty began firing at it, shattering its windshield and emergency lights. Police locked down the area spanning 6 blocks from the restaurant and established a command post 2 blocks away. 175 officers were deployed at strategic positions, soon joined by SWAT, the Special Weapons and Tactics team. But still, they were unsure of how to approach such a dangerous situation. Huberty returned to the inside of the restaurant and continued his killing spree. At one point, he went to the cashier counter to adjust the radio. Victims assumed to listen for news of the incident, but instead he turned it to a music station and began dancing. A few minutes later, he searched the kitchen area and found a group of employees hiding. Huberty exclaimed, "Oh, there's more. You're trying to hide from me, you bastards," and opened fire. 2 of the employees, 18-year-old Margarita Padilla and 17-year-old Wendy Flanagan, grabbed each other's hands and tried to run for it, but Huberty fatally shot Margarita. Wendy was able to make it to a basement utility room. Of the remaining group of hiders, Huberty shot and killed 21-year-old Paulina Lopez and 19-year-old Elsa Borbo Fierro. He then shot 17-year-old Albert Leos, critically wounding him. Running out of ammunition, Huberty heads to the front of the restaurant to reload, giving Albert an opportunity to escape by dragging himself down the stairs to join a group of survivors hiding in the basement utility room. 2 other employees from the group were able to successfully flee down a stairway and through to an emergency exit, escaping. Earlier that morning, Albert had actually contemplated not coming into work that day and joining his friends who invited him to hang out. But being the responsible young man that he was, he came into work instead. In the utility room, Albert would join 2 male and 3 female co-workers, one of whom was Wendy, who had taken refuge there, along with a woman and a baby. Once Albert arrived, he removed the shoelaces from his shoes and used them to make a tourniquet for his left arm, which was losing blood quickly. And he bit down on a cloth to stifle his cries of pain, to avoid putting the entire group at risk of being discovered. At one point, 11-year-old Aurora Pena, the young girl who was shielded by her 18-year-old pregnant aunt and was laying next to her slain aunt, cousin, and friends, heard a lull in the shooting and opened her eyes. Huberty happened to be staring in her direction and noticed her open her eyes. He cursed, threw some French fries at her, then shot her in the arm, neck, and jaw. She miraculously survived, but would spend longer in the hospital than any other survivor. Huberty would similarly return to shoot and kill other injured, but still alive victims. Like injured Jose Perez, who lay moaning in pain next to his friend, 22-year-old Gloria Gonzalez, and a young lady named Michelle Carncross, both of whom Huberty had already killed. After minutes passed, then an hour, Everyone inside the restaurant wondered, where are the police? At 5:05 p.m., over an hour after the first call to police was made, all responding law enforcement personnel were authorized to kill the assailant should they obtain a clear shot. At one point, the official green light to shoot was withdrawn, but was reinstated at 5:13. It was around that time that SWAT sharpshooter Charles Foster positioned himself along with a spotter onto the roof of the post office just south of the McDonald's. He could see the bodies on the floor of the restaurant, but he could also see that Huberty was at an advantage. Huberty had a clear view of the parking lot and the surrounding area, so anyone who tried to approach, even just to give aid to the people shot outside the restaurant, were driven away by more gunfire. The windows of the restaurant were both tinted and coated with a laminate. So not only was it hard to see into the restaurant due to the tinting, but once the windows were shot at and shattered, the laminate held much of them in place, spidering the windows and creating an even more obstructed view. And at 5 p.m., the sun also wreaked havoc on their ability to see into the restaurant. So, Foster's job was a challenge. He didn't actually see Huberty until just before shooting him, which happened when Foster finally got a glimpse of Huberty through the restaurant's double doors. The only doors whose safety glass was fully shattered out by Huberty's gunfire. Foster could see Huberty's legs dangling as he sat on top of the cashier counter, reloading one of his magazines with ammunition. Then Huberty hopped off the counter and began walking toward the shattered double doors. From Foster's vantage point, Huberty's head and neck were blocked by the door frame, but his chest and torso were not. At 5:17, Foster shot a single shot through Huberty's heart, killing him instantly. It was one of just 5 bullets fired by police throughout the duration of the massacre. The other 4 were fired at the same time as Foster's, but they missed the assailant.
PRT leader, we took him out with a shot.
Sniper 2.
Okay, I'm watching the suspect. I got his body in his hands. It doesn't appear to be any chest rising at all through binoculars. Like I said, there's been no movement since the shot.
The ordeal lasted 77 minutes. The assailant expended 257 rounds of ammunition, mostly from the Uzi. 21 people were killed and 19 were injured. 17 of the victims were killed inside the restaurant and 4 were killed just outside the restaurant. There were only 10 uninjured survivors from the inside of the restaurant, 6 of whom were hidden inside the basement utility room. The youngest person killed was just 8 months old, and the oldest was 74. While everyone was relieved the ordeal was over, no one had any idea of the devastation they'd find inside. Police entered, but were not prepared for what they saw. The carnage was unimaginable. Employees, customers, men, women, children, babies. They were laying everywhere. As SWAT Commander Jerry Sanders reflected, "I went through nightmares. So did a lot of the other guys. You can never put that vision out of your mind." Survivors were removed from the restaurant and treated. Guadalupe Del Rio, who had been shielded by her 2 friends, but was also shot herself, didn't realize that she'd been shot. An officer asked her afterward if she was okay. She kept saying yes. So rather than alarm her, the officer took her to an ambulance where they treated her for the gunshot. Once the ordeal was over and the dust began to settle, the focus was on the police response time. Given that there were multiple types of firearms being shot, as well as conflicting descriptions of the perpetrator, police contended that it was unclear how many assailants were inside the restaurant. They also reported that they were unsure whether any hostages were being held. Several law enforcement officers stated they thought it was a robbery gone wrong, and that the perpetrator was likely inside standing off with police and shooting out to police, but not shooting anyone inside. With the nearly constant, near-deafening sounds of 257 rounds fired throughout the ordeal, including into stainless steel equipment, and with victims clearly being murdered just outside of the restaurant, the claim that police didn't know that people were being shot inside was incomprehensible to survivors. Victims and their families additionally contend that individuals who escaped had informed police that there was just a single gunman holding no hostages and shooting everyone he encountered. Another point of contention between law enforcement and the victims and their families was the San Diego Police Department's initial report following the massacre. It indicated that most everyone injured or killed within the restaurant had been shot by Huberty in the first 10 minutes after he had entered the restaurant. This claim was hotly disputed by survivors, who stated Huberty had shot both unwounded and wounded people over 40 minutes after he first opened fire, and that many who were shot in the beginning didn't die right away and could have been saved had they received aid. They cited multiple instances where people were shot or reshot late into the rampage, including Jose Perez and Aurora Pina, mentioned previously. Ronald Herrera, who was shot by the gunman early on, then again 45 minutes later, as well as the group of employees Huberty found and massacred over 30 minutes after the rampage began. To this day, victims and their families strongly contend that waiting 77 minutes for help to intervene was a failure beyond measure that cost both injured and not yet shot victims their lives, while police contend that they responded appropriately given the information or lack of information they had at any given point, and also that they were tasked with weighing the safety of any hostages that might be inside, all amidst an unfamiliar, unprecedented, and unfathomably brutal scenario. In 1984, the San Isidro Massacre at McDonald's was the worst massacre by a gunman in U.S. history at the time. As of 2023, it now stands as the 8th worst. In the wake of the tragedy, McDonald's Corporation suspended all its advertising for the week following the massacre. Rival Burger King followed suit, suspending all its advertising as well. Baby Carlita, now Carla, was a miracle baby. After the massacre, where she was handed over to a stranger, Maricela and Astolfo, who underwent surgery at different hospitals, would be separated from her for 2 full weeks, all the while not knowing whether baby Carlita had survived, and unable to get connected with her. When they were reunited, doctors informed them that they had to remove part of Carlita's intestines and 30 pieces of shard. They said it was a miracle that she survived. Tragically, Astolfo would later be murdered in 1990. Albert Leos, the young man who crawled down the stairs to safety and fashioned his own tourniquet, went on to become a police officer. He now proudly serves as a captain at the San Diego Police Department. In 1986, Edna Huberty filed lawsuits against McDonald's, as well as Huberty's former employer, Babcock & Wilcox. She claimed that the fumes from Babcock & Wilcox and the food from McDonald's, specifically MSG, caused Huberty delusions and uncontrollable rage. Her lawsuits were dismissed. Edna Huberty died in 2003 of breast cancer. Several family members of those killed, along with survivors of the massacre, filed lawsuits against McDonald's and the San Diego Police Department for negligence. The suits were dismissed, and on appeal, the courts ruled in favor of the defendants. They ruled that McDonald's or any other business has no duty of care to protect patrons from an unforeseeable assault by a murderous madman, and the implemented security measures typically used by restaurants to deter criminals, such as guards and closed-circuit television cameras, could not possibly have deterred the perpetrator, as he did not care about his own survival. The courts also released the San Diego Police Department of any culpability or negligence. They stated, "In view of the sheer horror of the ordeal, it is difficult to imagine anything the police could have done or failed to do, which would have made the risk any greater than that to which the victims were exposed before the police arrived." In 2014, 30 years after the tragedy, Huberty's oldest daughter, Zelia, gave an interview for the first time. Having been just 12 years old at the time, she recalls how she watched the bloody tragedy from her window. She said, "I had a perfect view of it. I saw the car there. I saw everything. I saw people I knew, who I went to school with. I wasn't thinking anything that time, except better them than me. I know that's a horrible thing to say, but as a 12-year-old, that's the sort of thing you think," she said. She said that if she could turn back the clock, probably would have killed my father before any of this would have occurred. Her life was not easy after the shooting. She shared how she was treated poorly by people whenever they found out who her dad was. She moved twice within a year after the shootings and went to school under an assumed name, although she now uses her real name and still gets comments. She was taken to city-mandated therapy after the massacre, but considered the sessions a nuisance. Once they ended after 12 weeks, she never returned. She did have a fear for a while that she might turn into her father, seeing a lot of similarities between him and herself. But she recognized that she's educated, different, and that the acts he performed were a conscious decision. And the survivors. They were impacted too. Whether from the ongoing pain of their injuries or the trauma of having lived through what no one should have to, they continue to suffer the aftermath through this day. Many couldn't function, being affected by loud noises, crowds, and just normal daily occurrences. And being in restaurants was particularly frightening. One victim shared how her first thought when she enters a restaurant is, "Where are the exits?" And she's on high alert the entire time. As a result of the massacre, police developed special tactical teams to deal with mass shootings. They'd also implemented active shooter protocol, where the objective is to gain entry and take the shooter down as soon as possible. SWAT also now has its own fleet of helicopters. SWAT officers dedicated to hostage rescue and special responses, increased training, more resources, more tech, and more expertise in such scenarios all around. After the massacre, McDonald's moved swiftly to make repairs, and within 48 hours, they repaired the McDonald's and were ready to reopen its doors. But the community outcry was swift. They wouldn't hear of it. And McDonald's Corporation reversed the decision. The building was demolished on September 26, 1984, and the McDonald's Corporation donated $1 million to a San Ysidro Survivors Fund. Amidst protests from San Ysidro residents and donors, the first payout from this fund was issued to Etna Huri. McDonald's Corporation also donated the property to the city. And in 1988, Southwestern College built a satellite campus in its place. Then, in 1990, a monument was built to honor the victims of the massacre. The memorial is constructed of 21 hexagon-shaped granite pillars, ranging in height from 1 to 6 feet, each representing each victim, and a plaque lists their names along the heartfelt statement. In 2016, a documentary called 77 Minutes was released detailing the massacre. Ironically and tragically, the San Ysidro massacre has something in common with another, more recent mass shooting in the US, the Uvalde, Texas shooting. Despite the decades of time that passed between the two deadly massacres, the response time before the perpetrator was brought down in both cases was exactly 77 minutes. No closing comments for today, but we'd appreciate a like and subscribe if you like how we covered the case, and we'll look forward to reading your comments.